Okay, welcome, philosophy biology class. The paper for today is, but what are you really? The metaphysics of race. There's an image of the first page on the right-hand side. Now, the author of this piece that we're reading is Charles Mills. Mills is a political philosopher. He's Jamaican. He's from Jamaica. He's currently at the Graduate Center at CUNY. That's the City University of New York. Now, this particular essay comes from a collection of his essays called Blackness Visible, Essays on Philosophy and Race. Charles Mills, probably his most famous work, is a book called The Racial Contract. So the social contract idea or theory is a major theory in political philosophy. Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes and Kant have all sort of written about it. Modern defenders of the social contract theory will just sort of assume that it's kind of racially neutral. They don't mention race. They think, states are just agreements among people and race has nothing to do with it. What Mills argues in the racial contract is that race was kind of in it from the beginning. It's really the social contract is a contract between white Europeans who were planning on colonizing and controlling the rest of the world. And so really it's only a contract among white people. And so the kind of hierarchical nature of race and the white privilege and white superiority is kind of baked in from the very beginning. Okay, so the paper that we're reading, what is the conclusion? Well, he says race is real and it's socially constructed. Now, there's a sense in which I don't think he gives much of an argument for that. What he's really kind of doing is trying to explore what that actually means. I think he thinks that some authors have said it, but they've not really worked out what that means or how that works or what the metaphysics is. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, he agrees, for example, agrees with Appiah, that it's not biologically real. There are no natural divisions of people. Appiah thinks, so there's no races because that's what race is. Race is meant to be biological. So it's not real. But Mills wants to respond, no, race is real. There's a real fact about your race. There's an objective fact about what you are. It has to do with, for example, how you're treated, where your place in the social hierarchy is. Here's a nice quote from him. He says, race is a contingently, so it's only contingent. I'll talk about what that means in a minute, but it's a deep reality that structures our particular social universe. It has a social objectivity and causal significance that's very significant to know what your race is, or what the race of someone else is. Social scientists study race all the time. And that importance arises out of our particular history. That's why it's only contingent. Contingent as opposed to necessary. If the history of the world were different, the history of racial talk and racial theory were different, individuals who were otherwise exactly the same might have had different races, or race might not even exist. So that's why it's not necessary. In fact, it's different in different countries. It's been different over time. It changes over time. But right now, in the United States, in the late 20th century, when he's writing, it's a reality and it's deeply important and it's objective. There's a fact about your race. Okay, so he's just going to try to explore what that means and what could ground those facts. Now, he doesn't say, here's the definition of race. Instead, what he does is says, here's a bunch of things that you might think matter. So what we'll do is kind of look at these cases. If they all go together, then the cases will be easy. Everyone will agree. But let's look at some cases where they come apart. And that way you can kind of figure out which ones are really important and which ones are not. So here's 7 kind of potential criteria that we might use for categorizing somebody, for their racial identity. First, there's their bodily appearance, not just skin color, but kind of gross morphology. There's ancestry. There's their self, but it's not just in fact who their ancestors are, but whether they know it or not, and whether other people know it. That matters a lot for race, you might think. Their culture, that is how they choose to behave and act, who they hang around with. Their experience, how other people treat them, what kind of lives they've led. In the United States today, typically, white people and black people live very different kinds of lives. Certainly on average, they do. There's also subjective identification, what you choose to identify yourself as. Now, you might think that determines your race, but it's at least minimally something that might be relevant. Okay, so he's going to look at a bunch of 10 problem cases where these things don't all go in the same direction. Okay. Why do we do that? We're gonna see when they come apart. That's going to help us identify which criteria really matter. So the first, here's his table. He only puts the first 7 cases up here. This is a little chart of, and he's only considering white and black. There are other races, but you could ask yourself what happens if they're different races, not just white and black. For the reading questions for this week, I want you to make me a little chart of the 10 cases and tell me, what race you think they are. Okay, so sometimes Mills will give his opinion as though he'll say, look, this is in fact what we will all say. Other times he seems to think it's not that clear, and so he doesn't really want to answer, but he'll still have some things to say. Okay, case 1 is the case he calls conscious temporary passing. So here the person self-identifies as black. If you ask them, they'll say they're black, typically, but they appear white. They can appear white. If they want to, they can pass. Now, Mills says they have known black ancestry, but his actual case of this is Walter White, whose ancestry was only 1/64th black. If you think it matters, just sort of change that number. It's hard to imagine that their ancestry is completely black and they look white, but that's possible. So the case of Walter White was he was the head of the NAACP for about 20 years. He went to a historically black college. His first marriage was to a black woman. He participated in black culture. He identified as black, but occasionally, to help investigate lynchings in the South, he would temporarily pretend to be a white man so that he could talk to other white people and get answers as to his questions about the lynching. So now what happens while he's passing? Well, you could say now he's actually white, or he changes race, or you could say he's always white, but Mills thinks, no, that's crazy. Mills thinks he's black, he's always black, even when he's pretending. Sometimes he pretends, but he's always black. And he just asserts that as though, of course, we're all going to agree. So that tells you right there, for example, skin color is not determinant of race. Now, case 2 is a little bit more plausible that they're white. This person actually self-identifies as white. So they have the same appearance, but they choose to live as white. Now, again, this is an example, he says, of black ancestry, but it's mixed ancestry is the most plausible kind of case. So here, the person it's permanent passing. They're choosing to live as a white person. So some of the children of Sally Hemings, as I mentioned in class this week, he mentions an art critic, I think, or maybe a music critic, I can't remember. But there are many examples of this. Now, and if you know who Rachel Dolezal is, there's a really interesting Netflix documentary about her. I believe it's called The Case of Rachel. I'm not confident about that. That's the case of somebody with obviously white parents, very white skin, but went to a historically black college and chooses to be identified in the African American community. And she was head of the local NAACP chapter for a while before she was sort of publicly outed. But that's with the races switch. I'll talk a little bit more about her case later. So what do we say about this case? Well, here again, Mills assumes many people will say they're black because of their ancestry, but people treat them as white. I mean, why not say they're white? Now, one thing you might have is, well, this person knows they're white or knows they're black, they're really black. And in the back of their mind, there must be some sort of psychic pull on them saying, ooh, I'm really black. So we can just get rid of that. So imagine case 3. This is the case where the person is just like case 2. They self-identify as white, they appear white, but actually they have black ancestry. But what's different about this case is they don't even know it. So you can't assume that they have some sort of psychic pull on them. They don't deeply really think that they're black. No, they just think that they're white. The case he gives, a Mark Twain novel, Pudd'nhead Wilson. So there's a slave woman who I think is 1 1/16 Black ancestry. She has her own child, so who's 1/32. Of course, is the slave master's child, and the slave master's legitimate child, also, who looks white. Of course, they both look white. So what does she do? She switches the children in their cribs. So then she raises the master's legitimate son as though that's her son, and her biological son is raised as the master's son. He grows up as called Tom Driscoll, I believe. So, Tom grows up to be a, privileged white boy who thinks that he's white. Now, in that particular case, eventually he finds out. The woman eventually tells him. But imagine that he never finds out, if you think that makes a difference. He lives his entire life thinking he's white. Everybody thinks he's white. No one ever knows. You could imagine that not even the mother knows that they were just accidentally switched in the crib. It was a hospital mix-up. So now what do you say? Well, if you say the person is really Black, then very plausibly you think that race just is a biological reality, because it seems like you think that ancestry must overwhelm everything else, or genetics, or whatever you're thinking of, because self-identification, color, social views, everything else points to them being white. Now, Mills actually doesn't think they're Black. Mills actually says, I think we should just treat them as white, because we do treat them as white. That's their place in the social hierarchy. So here is where the first kind of case where it's going to come apart from a lot of other views. So Mills seems to say they're actually the race that everyone thinks they have. Now, you might worry, you say, but wait, what about when if that person actually finds out they have Black ancestry, like Tom Driscoll did? Now we say things like they've discovered that they were Black, and we say they were Black all along. Now, that is one thing people say, but Mills suggests, isn't it, he says, just as plausible to say that they've actually changed their race. Once they recognize their Black ancestry and they identify as Black and everyone knows it, then they're Black. But actually, he says, they really were not Black before. They were really white before. So he says that's just as plausible. Whatever you think of the case, that's going to help you answer the question of what you think determines race. Now, to worry about how important self-identification is, we start to get to these other cases. So here's problem case 4, helpfully called Mr. Oreo, to help you remember that he's Black on the outside and white on the inside. This is a common sort of slang term for particular people. So this person self-identifies as white, or I'm just like these other white people, but everyone treats them as Black. They're visibly Black. They have Black ancestors. Everybody knows it. He just wishes to be Black. Mills says, at least in the United States, that we all treat this person as Black. And in fact, they're really Black. So this case is meant to show you that self-identification is not everything. On the other hand, a huge thing that was important was not just his ancestry, but just the way he looked, that everybody treated him a certain way. Well, imagine that Mr. Oreo, who desires to be white, actually undergoes this physical transformation. And he doesn't just darken his skin. He has this magic sci-fi machine, the Schuyler machine, after a sci-fi novel. Anything that you think matters. So if you think you can tell the race of it or the ancestry of a person based on, let's say, skin color, hair, facial characteristics, nose and eye shape, fine, change all of those things. This person is physically changed. They look just like a white person. Okay, but their ancestry, of course, hasn't changed. You can't change that. And their genes haven't changed. So if they have kids, then maybe you'll know. So what do you say about this person? Mills actually says a case can be made. He says it like he's not so sure what to say. But he thinks a case can be made that they've actually changed their race. Because again, he thinks in case 3, the person who believes they're white and always did, and doesn't know their ancestry, he says they really are white. So why isn't Mr. Oreo just like that? Well, you might think it's different because it was a change and he used to be Black, but it's an interesting question. Okay, case 6, you might say, why does this even exist? And we already talked about case 3. Well, so case 6 is just case 3, that is the unconscious passing, just with white and Black switched. Mills thinks it's possible you might think there's a difference because in our culture, white is the higher race as opposed to Black. So here, Now ask about the white child raised as a black person. They actually have white ancestry, but they're thought to be black. They don't know it. So this is just to force us to think about whether there's an asymmetry here. Case 7 is the case of Mr. Oreo reversed. Now they're white on the outside, but they're culturally black. Now, this is a little bit more reminiscent of the Rachel Dolezal case. Here, it's, she was passing as black. Part of the reason she passed as black is because in the United States, black people are of all different shades. I mean, her skin is not particularly dark. But there are so many people that we identify as black with very light shaded skin. So, she wore a wig. She culturally was black. Her children are very dark skinned. So that, helps you identify, oh, well, she's black too. So what do you say? And again, there's a lot of special things about her case. But it's supposed to be like the Mr. Oreo case, but reversed. That's what case 7 is. Okay, what is case 8? Well, so imagine that you say the person is really white or really black, and you think it's clear. You can further push on your intuitions and kind of learn something by altering that case in various ways. So let's call them the white renegade. This is the person who has white ancestry, but wishes to be black. Okay. What if the person actually had unknown black ancestry? So really, they had some black ancestors. Would that make a difference to you? What if they discovered their black ancestry and made it public? Now, probably we would start treating them as black, but would that make a difference to you? What if they discover it, but they keep it secret? So now it's not public, but in fact, they know when they're acting black, they know it's because they're really a black person. Now, what if they discover it and announce it and everyone starts treating them that way? But actually, it's mistaken. It was a mistake. Turns out, really, their ancestry is all white. How do you answer these questions? I think Mills thinks some of it is unclear. But if you have a strong opinion, it's probably because he thinks there's an objective fact about the race of the person. Now, case 9 and 10 are interesting cases. They have to do with self-identification and whether you can have new races. So case 9 is the case of biracial or multiracial individuals. Now, a lot of the cases were already multiracial individuals, but what was different about them is that they identified one way or the other. Here, imagine somebody who, when you ask, they'll say they're biracial, like Tiger Woods, who identifies as a particularly multiracial mix. What do you say? Are they a new race? Are they both? Or are they all of the other races? Are they no race? What do you say? Does self-identification even matter here? They could be the same, genetic makeup as somebody else who identifies as black. Does that make a difference? So that's an interesting question. And if you are kind of take a hard line and say sort of any known ancestry of, 2 different races just means you're biracial, well then lots and lots and lots of people are biracial or multiracial. And that's fine. You might think that that's true, but we don't typically treat them that way here in the United States. Case 10 is the case of an individual who self-identifies as not having a race. Now, often that's because they think nobody has a race. Like Naomi Zach thinks that nobody has a race. She has pretty dark skin though. So, other people think she has a race, but she does not accept it. She says, I don't have a race. Now, she doesn't think anybody does. You could also just imagine somebody saying, I refuse to participate in that system. Does that really matter? Is it possible that we could have a view that says, well, some people have a race, but some people don't? Is that even possible? It's kind of unclear. Okay, so those are all the cases. Now, what does Mills want you to think about this? Well, what's the purpose of the cases? The purpose of the cases is to help us identify what our concept of race actually is. Now, some of you may discover that the concept of race that you have is really a biological one. That seems to be what Appiah would predict. If you think, for example, ancestry is everything. All this social stuff that Mills is talking about, going in the machine and changing, and none of that matters. It doesn't matter how people treat you. It doesn't matter if you're aware of your ancestry, it's actual ancestry. Mills actually thinks that some of the cases are unclear, but he thinks that actually cases like case 3, the case of unconscious passing, he thinks the person raised as a white man is white because we treat them as white. And if you agree with him about that case, then you're going to think, first of all, you have to think race is objectively real. You can't, because the person is white, so it's not that there's no race. But also, you can't think race is biological, because what biological fact is there? I guess there's that the person looks white, but you don't want to just go with skin color. Then you get, case 1 or case 2. So because Mills thinks you're going to agree with him, at least about some cases, then you're going to agree that race has to be objective. The idea that there's no fact about these cases. Take a case like Mr. Oreo that you think is, Mills thinks is kind of obvious. Mills is like, yeah, he's black. Everybody thinks he's black. Everyone's going to treat him as black. He looks black. His ancestry is black. Just because he likes white culture doesn't matter. He's black. If you think that, then you're an objectivist about race. It's just that there's no underlying biological reality to it. So that's the point of the cases.